Today we're going to talk about Frigidaire stoves that have problems in the oven. You open it up and you notice that even though you've turned everything on, it's just not heating, or it's heating very poorly, under 200 degrees. Why would this happen? Well, we're going to go over 4 or 5 different things that could cause this problem, that would cause your oven not to heat very well. There's some really easy things you can do to determine what the major component is that's gone bad. And the great thing is that if you do have this issue, it's usually not very expensive to get this solved, much cheaper than it would be to replace the stove. And you can definitely do everything yourself. So let's get inside this and try to figure out what's going on. And if you do need one of the parts in the video, I do have links in the description to buy some of the things to replace on this. It would help the channel out a ton if you decide to replace the parts.
For the repairs in this video, you're going to need the following items to do all the fixes: a 1/4-inch hex head screwdriver with a Phillips bit as well, a multimeter with probes and alligator clamps for leads, a pair of needle nose pliers, rubber gloves if you decide to deal with live electricity, a phone to take pictures of wires if you're going to remove certain wires from the control board, and then clamps for the spade connectors if you replace the element from the front of the oven. Go ahead and turn a knob on, preferably one that has a high output, to the fullest setting possible. Now, if you do this and any of the burners turn on and run just fine, it means that the entire oven is in fact getting 240 volts of electricity, and you need that amount of electricity for the entire machine to operate. If the oven and stove both are not working, you have an electricity problem, not an oven problem. Next, let's assume the top works. Try the broil feature. Does this mode work at all or not? If the broil heats up, this localizes the problem entirely to the bake element or the bake element on the control board. If the broil feature cannot heat up at all, this means the problem is either the control board, a wire, or back again to the electrical issue we mentioned just a few seconds ago. Testing all these features, though, are what we need to do to find out what the critical problem is with the unit. So let's first start with the power cord and electrical outlet. To start, you can use a multimeter and set it to AC voltage. You can unplug the power cord slightly, then use the lead probes of the multimeter to test for power on the plug. Make sure to be careful and use rubber gloves when doing this. You want to test the 3 major prongs on the power cord. Some may be black with 4 prongs, but the key here is to test the left and right spades to the middle neutral individually, then test the left and right spades. You can also unplug the power cord fully and do the same test with your multimeter probes inside the outlet, but in my experience, it's difficult to get the probes to contact fully, but this is also safer since the plug is not installed to the wall. But either way, you should find that you get 240 volts to the left and right prongs, or 120 volts on a particular leg. If you don't get that, then chances are the breaker needs to be fully reset. If the voltage issue persists after cycling the breaker, it could be a bad outlet or breaker itself, and that would require an electrician, not an appliance technician. Next, let's look at the power cord and where it goes to your stove or range, depending on what you want to call this thing. The terminal block is usually at the bottom center of the unit either way. Inspect the terminal block for damage. Are all the wires on the cord to the block intact? Is the terminal block itself burnt or showing any signs of damage? What about the 3 wires that go from the block into the oven cavity? If anything looks burnt, damaged, or destroyed, this would be the cause of your issue and you need to replace it. If you want to, you can perform the same test we just did at the power outlet on the terminal block. You would test center to left, then center to right, and both should get 120 volts from left to middle and then right to middle, or near that number. Then the left to right should be about 240 volts. If you don't get anything close to that number, then something's wrong between the cord and the terminal block that needs fixed. At this point, you want to go ahead and unplug the stove for now until we get to some future tests. Another easy check before we tear anything apart is just visually inspecting the heating element itself. Sometimes if the element went bad, you could see scorch marks or damage on the heating rod. It could be charred, burnt, exploded, or many other things. But if you see a physical defect, then more than likely that is your issue and you need to replace the heating element. For a quick hack to remove the heating element, you simply need to remove the 2 screws holding the element in place, They could be oriented a little bit differently than this. Once you have both screws removed, pull the element slightly forward towards you, and if you are fortunate, you'll see the collared wires that are attached to the element. Hold them in place with any sort of clamp, one on each side. We just need enough room to clamp the connectors and hold them in place. Then you can remove the element from the terminals and replace it as needed. This would allow you to replace the bake element without any further tear down or testing, getting behind it, having to take the whole back panel off. Then go ahead and put the screws back in, and you would be done with this installation if that was the issue. But let's go ahead and get further into the unit to test more components. You need to be able to get to the rear of the unit to do these further tests. Next, use a screwdriver or drill gun with a 1/4-inch hex head on it to remove all the screws from the top panel. Some of these types of Frigidaire stoves could have an upper and lower panel, and some could just have one panel, and this will vary from model to model, but in this case there are two panels. Each of these panels have 5 to 7 screws that hold the metal plate in place, and you want to make sure not to remove the screws that are on the chassis because some of them will look like they could hold the panel on. Just remove the ones that hold the silver plate in place. Once you have them removed, take them away from the unit. With the entire back off, the first thing you could check and test is the oven bake element. Make sure to inspect the wires where they attach to on the oven element for any sort of damage. In some cases, these harnesses could have been accidentally burnt, causing the unit not to heat up. Next, go ahead and remove one of the wires from the element and set your multimeter to ohms resistance, and we're going to test the element from the back side of the stove. With your multimeter, press the leads of the multimeter into each side of the element to test for ohms, and again, one spade terminal needs removed to isolate it. You should get between 10 and 20 ohms of resistance between the element. If you get an OL symbol or a value that's extremely high, then the element's bad and needs replaced. Also, theoretically, you could have done this test from the front of the unit when we removed the element from the front. That's an option as well, but this is at least easier to show you how to do on camera. On the right side, near the middle of the oven, is the temperature sensor. If this doesn't work right, it can trick the oven into not heating at the right temperature or heating at all. Sometimes you could get an error code like an F30 if it was totally damaged. To test the oven temperature sensor, set your multimeter yet again to ohms resistance. Press the leads of the multimeter into the sensor, and you probably need to have it removed from the harness to see what kind of reading you get. You should get between 1050 ohms and 1100 ohms of resistance. If it's much above or below that value, then the sensor is off spec and needs replaced. If you get an OL symbol, it definitely needs replaced, as it should show some sort of resistance value. To remove the sensor, there's one or maybe even 2 screws that hold the housing in place, like you see here. In the case of this one, I have to rotate it counterclockwise and then remove the sensor from the housing. The secret to the oven temperature sensors is that they're all practically identical when you test them. They all run between 1050 ohms and 1100 ohms, even beyond Frigidaire stoves. This is actually kind of a universal replacement that exists for a fraction of the OEM price. The key between all these different sensors is just matching the length of the probe up as well as the harness that it connects to. And I will have a link in the description for some of these sensors that I'm showing you on camera. And if you buy from the link, it helps support the channel. To reinstall the right sensor, simply reinsert it into the slot that you took it out, and then reinstall the screw that holds it properly in place, then plug the wire harness back in to make sure it's securely placed. Next, let's get to the trickiest but most important test, I think, of the Frigidaire oven if it doesn't work. It's testing the control board to see if the board itself is bad. First, note the wires going to and from the board located here. Take your multimeter, and I'm using alligator clips to clip them onto the wires that connect the oven board to the heating elements at the bottom, the baked element that we tested earlier. In the case of this stove, it's yellow and orange, which we saw a few moments ago. For this test, you can use the long probes as well, just not as easy to do. For this test, you'll need to have the stove plugged into electricity and make sure to be very careful as you're dealing with live electricity. Set your multimeter to voltage AC. With the oven control board on, make sure that it's set to any particular time, that it's not flashing 12 o'clock, because if it blinks and it hasn't been set, sometimes that can prevent the stove from turning on at all. Once it's ready to go, set the oven to a bake temperature. I usually set it for about 375 to 400. Once this clicks on, you should see 240 volts AC. This means that the oven is trying to send a signal to the bake element, allowing it to heat. If your multimeter showed a value that was much lower than 240 volts, like let's say 160 or less, then the board is shot and needs replaced or refurbished. I do have a video on how to fix these boards if you had a soldering iron and the means to replace the relay. But in most cases, though, replacing the board is rather affordable. To do that, take a picture of the wires and how they are installed on the control board. Then begin to remove the wires from the board. If you have difficulty taking these wires out by hand, it can be hard, so I would suggest a pair of needle nose pliers. The board itself is held in by 4 Phillips head screws. These are all quite easy to remove. Just make sure to have your hand in place to hold the board when the last screw is being removed, as it will fall away from the housing once you take it out. Here is the new and old board, and they are quite different from each other. The new one is a board from Choice Parts that fits a ton of Frigidaire stove models, and although it looks quite different on the back side, it works perfectly fine for a fraction of the price of the new OEM Frigidaire board. Now note there are going to be different styles of boards. Some boards have an 8-button front interface and others have a 10. This is a 10-button model, and you would need to match at least that part up to ensure that it works. Depending on the situation that you have, you can transfer the old beat-up plastic overlay from the old board to your new one, but I went ahead and got a brand new overlay that I'm installing to this board. It's the new 2024 interface, and it makes the stove look brand new for just a few dollars. To install it, I need to remove the sticky backing from the overlay and then line it up to the buttons and the LCD screen and then press it in firmly to apply. Before I install the board, the overlay does have a plastic liner on it that I need to remove to make it look just a little bit nicer once I install it to the unit. I just need to install the 4 black Phillips screws to mount the control board in place. Next, with the control board mounted, I'm going to go ahead and reattach the wires into their proper place. Each spade connector has a letter and number on it. They need matched up from the previous board, and I'm using the picture I took on my phone as well as the numbers on the old board to match everything up. There are only 5 wires and then the big terminal connector at the bottom, and this is very easy to do, I think. If you find it difficult, though, to press the terminals and spade connectors into place, use a pair of needle nose pliers to make sure that they are firmly and securely put in place. You don't want any wiggle room on these. If you replace the board, just make sure to reprogram the clock to make sure that it works and you set a time, and it actually operates a whole lot nicer than even an old working board would be. As you can see here, once we have it programmed and turned on, everything was successfully installed with the new board. The bake element is working really, really well on this unit now. With those things being done, the last thing I want to show you how to do that we've kind of discussed earlier was replace the terminal block if it melted. Although this block actually works on this Frigidaire stove, it's in terrible shape and I don't like it. If I keep the terminal block on this, I think it will melt when I sell it to a customer, and we don't want to have that. The first step is to remove the wires that are attached to the terminal if they are intact. In the case of this unit, it requires a 3/8 socket wrench to unscrew the nut that holds the 3 wires in place. Once the nuts are removed, then remove the wires from the terminal block. If any wires got burnt up, you would need to replace them. Next, remove the screws that hold the block into place. Typically, it will be about 2 screws on the block, and then a green screw may have a copper grounding strap that needs removed as well. Now, the interesting thing once you remove the terminal block is that there are 6 or 8 screw holes behind this. Your Frigidaire stove can probably support multiple different kinds of terminal blocks that are better and possibly cheaper than the crappy one that I just took off. The one that I'm installing is the one that we use in all the stoves at our store, as I like them a lot more. It installs with 2 screws slightly differently, but it's supported on this chassis, and it's very easy to mount these 2 screws. Next, we'll go ahead and install the grounding strap again. If you're using a 4-wire connector for the stove, you would not need the grounding strap, by the way. Next, I'm matching up and reinstalling the wires to the terminal block. And again, if you had damaged wires, these are 10 AWG wires. You'd mount the wires to the posts, then tighten them on to the posts with the provided nuts and secure them in place. The nuts from the old terminal block actually work really well, so I'm going to reuse them on this, but the new terminal block package does have similar ones as well, and I will have a link for the terminal block I used in this video, because for Frigidaire, I think these are the best that they make. They're also rather affordable. Next, let's go ahead and reattach the 2 back plates that we took off in this video to fix the stove. Yours may have the 2 panels or just one, but at any rate, just line the holes up on the panel and put the screws in that were removed. And remount them using the 1/4-inch screwdriver or drill gun that you used earlier. Your model could have 6 or 8 screws per panel. Top plate goes on the same way and again could contain 4 to 6 screws. Just make sure that they line up all properly and the fitting is tight against the frame. Finally, since I showed you how to replace the terminal block, here's how you would install the power cord back onto the posts. You would line them up, and then once they're on, you'd take a screwdriver or socket wrench and then use the hex screws that were included with the package to secure the wires onto the posts. I prefer this rather than using screws to clamp down the power cord because this is much safer and secure. It's very hard for these to strip out. Once you have the nuts on, you don't want any side-to-side play or wiggle room on the power cord because that's generally what would cause one of these to melt and get burnt up in the first place. Also, I didn't show it in the video, but make sure your power cord has a strain relief on it to help keep this connection secure for years to come. These are all the major reasons the oven on your stove would not work. The only 2 things we did not cover extensively in this unit would be if you have a thermal fuse on the back of the stove, you would test this with a multimeter for continuity, and if you did not get continuity, it would be bad and needed replaced, but this unit physically did not have a thermal fuse. The other thing we kind of mentioned a little bit were wires that were damaged or broken somewhere on the unit. This would happen between the stove control and the bake element. Usually the damage is somewhere on the exposed metal terminal connectors, but in rare instances it could be somewhere in the middle that you would have to trace down and find. But at any rate, I hope this video helps you, and if you find that you needed any parts to replace on your unit, make sure to use the links that we have in the description, the pinned comments, or the YouTube shopping link, and I hope that this video helps you get your oven back to work and have a great day.